Most of us have had times in our lives when we felt like we don't fit in, but what if you always felt out of place no matter where you are? That's the reality for many people on the autism spectrum who are known as neurodivergent, a name given to those whose brain processes information in a way that's different to the majority.
I first saw a psychologist when I was in year 12, and the approach that was taken, that they were more centered towards kids and young people, but their approach to me felt like it was like psychology for dummies kind of thing. You know, it's like, if you have a bad thought, think to yourself, is this rational? I'm like, I know it's not rational. That's why I'm talking to you. I want to shut out the voices. I want to, I want to fix, basically, is what I was looking for.
At 28, Callum Reid is only now accepting the reality of living life as someone who's not neurotypical. It's taken a lifetime of self-torment trying to force a square peg into a round hole for him to realise everything that's great about being just the way he is. He works a 9 to 5, but his passion is producing electronic music under the name Lezen, and we first met a decade ago volunteering at our local radio station. This is Callum Reid. Welcome to Youngblood, the volunteer video podcast dedicated to young men's mental health. I'm your host, Cal McPherson, and this is a platform for young men and their loved ones to share lived experience stories and show that no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Suicide is the #1 killer of young people, and changing that starts with speaking up. So let's do it. This show touches on some tough topics that may provoke strong emotions. If you find anything in this chat distressing, please do whatever you need to do to look after yourself. This episode is sponsored by Ski for Life, an Aussie charity that does a phenomenal job raising money and awareness to support mental health and suicide prevention in the community. Go to skiforlife.com.au to find out more. Callum, when you were a kid, how was the way you processed sound and touch different from the norm?
From a sound side of things, easily overstimulated. So I went to primary school out north, and a lot of the classrooms were this sort of shared classroom sort of setup where there were lots of transportables and whatnot, and you'd have classroom A and classroom B, take down the sort of divider in the middle and share lessons together. And some classrooms like that were a bit more chaotic than others. And I'd get super, super overwhelmed and overstimulated in those sorts of environments. So, back then it was making sure I was in a classroom where, things weren't too chaotic. But I think it's an important call out, like when I was a lot younger and through primary school and whatnot, people's understanding of what being on the autism spectrum meant was very, very different. And, I had instances where I had teachers who would have said to my parents that, there was something wrong with him, or I had one primary school teacher when I was in reception, in fact, say to my parents, Callum will turn out to be a child delinquent, because they would just see it as, I'd be tuned out or I would be ignoring them or whatever, when in actual fact it was like I was overstimulated, I was having auditory processing issues.
Because there was less understanding back then, it was seen as an attitude problem.
Yeah, basically. And just that misunderstanding, I guess, as to, what's really happening there.
So can you just explain when stimulus is coming in, whether that be lots of noise or lots of action happening in front of you when you're a kid, how would you receive that? Like, what would go on in your head when that was around you?
Yeah, so I guess being on the spectrum is different for everybody. So my personal experience is very different to the next person's. And it's stuff that I've built up more of a tolerance to, is kind of how I'd explain it now in later life. But yeah, when I was a kid, the auditory side was particularly sort of pronounced, I guess, and impactful. The easiest way I can explain it is if you're in it's like a loud cafe environment, and you've got lots of people around you all having different conversations, all that kind of stuff. And most neurotypical people could probably shut out those noises and shut everything out. Yeah. Whereas for me, everything around me is at equal volume, and everything's just this floodgate of noise hitting me.
So you couldn't focus anywhere.
Yeah, correct. And in some senses, that's a little bit of a superpower, because you can kind of tune in and have selective points where you're like listening into that conversation or that one. But if you're not in control of it, so to speak, yeah, everything's just hitting you all at once. And that's the same for a lot of senses for me, where I would get quite overwhelmed with taste as well. So I had very selective eating habits. And to one person, that's, oh, you're a fussy eater. To the other person, it's, yeah, a sensitivity where, you know, any intense kind of flavors would just be crazy, crazy overwhelming. And you see that with, you know, lots of young kids who have quite bland diets. That's kind of by choice, because anything with much flavor is really overwhelming for them.
So when you were feeling overwhelmed in some way, what would happen? Would you shut down? What do you remember about being in those situations and seeing everyone else seem to be fine and yet you weren't?
It's interesting because I actually had a couple of kids when I was younger who were, I guess, I don't like to think of being on the spectrum as you're more or less, because that's not how it works, but their needs were a lot more severe than mine, and their behavioral problems were a lot more significant. So I was kind of in this weird middle ground where there were absolutely kids around me who were like completely neurotypical, and they would be the ones where you kind of perceive them as, you know, maybe looking at you a bit weird, or, you know, what's Callum doing now kind of thing. But then I would have other kids who were in my classroom who would be throwing tables and chairs around, or like biting other kids and all this kind of stuff. So the way that you would see their symptoms kind of lashing out and whatnot, that triggering of that flight, fight, freeze response was a lot more visceral. So I kind of swept under the radar comparatively to a lot of other kids. I think for me, it was a lot more internalized than other kids who, yeah, lash out and things like that. But I would hit a boiling point and get to a point, I guess, where I couldn't take anymore. And that would then result in a, you know, quite significant visceral reaction. You know, examples of moments where I'd, yeah, like hit kids and things like that, where it was just because I couldn't take any more on board. I couldn't internalize anything else, any emotions or anything like that.
And you'd feel like that every day?
It would come and go, and it would build up, like I said, like almost kind of like a pot on the stove sort of feeling, where it's boiling, and then eventually just spills out over the top. So lots of little moments, even now, to be honest, as an adult, like lots of little moments can build up over time. And if you're not mindful of that, and I guess trying to be resilient and focus on, you know, your inner self and how you're feeling and your emotions, it can be very easy to let it boil out. Yeah.
What were you told about the way you were when you were a kid? Like, how was it explained to you?
I had a mixed bag, I guess, in the sense that I knew I was different. For example, my mum in particular, because when I was little, my dad was doing his PhD. So he was studying and working heaps, and my mum would take me out of class at school to go to occupational therapy. And, you know, I'd come back and other kids would be like, oh, what, you got taken out of school? That you got to, you know, go have Macca's for lunch or something? That's sick. Why don't I get to do that? So like there was that side. I never really questioned it necessarily though. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, that's just what we do. Like, this is great. So
they didn't tell you that you were on the autism spectrum though, or that you had autism? No,
so I absolutely did. But I guess within my family and within my circle, so I think it was so normalized to the point where I felt incredibly accepted and understood. My family, my space was, you know, my safe zone, so to speak. I think it was mostly just external factors and other people that made it feel different, made it feel less normalized, so to speak. So I'm actually extremely grateful for, you know, my parents and my whole family who, I guess, just accepted me exactly as I was. They never made a point of, you know, a point of it or calling it out necessarily, because it was just so normalized and accepted, and I was so valued and loved by them. So it was never an issue. It was never a thing, if that makes sense.
So you had that with your family. When did you feel out of place?
Definitely as the years sort of went by and you get older, start going through puberty, and I guess particularly through sort of mid-late primary school, you start to notice people are becoming good friends with each other, little social circles, that kind of stuff. But I actually had heaps of moments when I was in primary school where, I would have people who would like run away from me. It's a bit of a, sad story, but like I would spend my recess and lunch. I wouldn't eat my recess lunch because I would spend the whole time chasing after who I thought, my friends, playing what I thought was playing chasey and whatever, when actually they were just running away from me because they didn't like me or didn't want to be my friend, whatever. And then I'd come home and mum and dad were like, how come you haven't had your food? And I'd be like, because I was doing this instead and I was running around. And particularly that sort of social element, you don't understand that necessarily when you're 7.
And that feeling carried on throughout your schooling to an extent, like trying to be part of something, but being on the outside looking in.
Yeah, and it definitely felt worse and worse as time went on. The ways that I felt a lot more accepted were through things like sport. So I was really athletic throughout middle and high school years. I was, one of the fastest runners in my school and all this kind of stuff, played for the A soccer team, whatever. So I found a lot of social acceptance through my athleticism and through sport. And a lot of my social connections and whatnot were through that sort of way as well, especially in the middle years, going to an all-boys school. That was, you're the king of shit hill kind of thing if you could kick a footy. So all of that kind of stuff made me feel a little bit more sort of like I was fitting in. But definitely when you get older and throughout high school years, right in the thick of, starting to date people and all of the sort of social drama that comes with high school. And I have quite a strong element of social justice in myself as well. And there'd be things happening around me I wouldn't agree with. I would be very vocal about those moments and would quite often get put down for speaking my mind and speaking out. So I definitely felt by the time I got to the end of high school, I was like, I could probably count my close friendship group in like one hand sort of thing. And typically when I got to the end of a schooling point, the end of primary, end of middle, end of high school, felt ostracized from the people around me.
So what were the barriers for connecting with people? And how would you feel in your relationships with others? Did you feel like you were able to have some depth there with some, or was it always like there was just something in the way and you weren't really close to anyone?
It's an interesting question because it has mostly to do with that thing of like past experiences. I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to, is the idea of if something's happened to you once, what are the odds of it happening again? And for me, the way that sort of shows itself is, I guess, that fear of being hurt, that fear of being misunderstood. I think I've spent the majority of my life struggling and attempting to be understood by other people. And when you go through that for so much of your life, ultimately you just get scared of connecting with people at the risk of getting hurt, basically. Obviously, you can't have any of the good without the bad, right? So you kind of have to put yourself out there to make new friends and, grow in your personal life, your professional life, whatever.
Would you ever show people who you were, or were you always just showing them what you thought they wanted to see?
A bit of both. It would depend on the person. When I was younger, I definitely didn't have the confidence to be myself. So I would be a bit of a chameleon and became incredibly good at masking. Some of that was that self-protection kind of element, particularly through the middle years where I'd just been on the back of, being bullied pretty relentlessly for years. And then I was like, screw that. I'm going to put on this persona almost of, being one of the cool kids, being tough, all of that kind of stuff.
So you were being yourself for a time, and that resulted in you getting picked on. So you learned, well, who I am is no good. So I have to borrow bits from here and here and try and mirror what other people who seem to be accepted do so that I'll stop getting bullied.
Yeah. And then I had a moment at the end of year 8 where I went for like a school leadership role, and one of the teachers at the school basically pulled me aside and was like, we won't let you go for that role because of who you associate with and because of who you're friends with. So I had this real kind of, I guess, impactful moment in my world where I was like, I'm not aligning with my values as a person. I'm not being my true self out of fear of ridicule and being judged and bullied and whatnot. But that's now stopping me from chasing after the things I actually want. So I got a lot better around that point at being myself. But I think, yeah, like I said earlier, by the time I got to the end of high school through year 12 in particular, I was struggling so much mentally and with my physical health as well by that point, that being myself also, once again, didn't feel like it was working for me.
So what were you struggling with then?
Throughout high school, it was mostly a lot of self-image struggles. So things I do still struggle with a little bit now, but back then it was, how I look, how I'm perceived by others, how I relate to other people. I cared a great deal about, how girls would see me and how, I guess, what my friends thought of me, why they were friends with me. I used to sort of question of like, are they just friends with me to get something out of me, or almost?
How does being neurodivergent factor into all of that on reflection? Because I mean, you're explaining a lot of things that people go through in high school, and we have those anxieties and we're just growing up. We haven't got it worked out yet. But your relationship with yourself and sort of your denial of what you now know is who you are, how did that factor into all those things?
Yeah. There were things that I was never open about because of that fear of judgment. So to be quite honest, like, it's only been in the last year that I've actually been vocal talking about the fact that I am on the autism spectrum and the fact that I have struggled with these things. Back then, my friends would attest that they would have just been like, oh, that's just Callum. Like, that's just who he is. That's, how he behaves, how he reacts to things, whatever. But yeah, back then it was not necessarily like an answer to it as to why I was a certain way, why I would react to things or behave a certain way, say certain things. And for me, for being on the spectrum, it had a lot to do with emotional regulation, had a lot to do with that feeling of being loved and being accepted for who you are. And to be honest, I got to a point where in my head I was like, if I tell people that I'm on the spectrum, I'm going to just lose all my friends, basically. And I'm going to get bullied and I'm going to be ostracized.
So you weren't in denial of it to yourself. Like, you knew that you were on the spectrum and always had been, but you felt such a need to cover that up for fear of judgment.
Yeah.
And that's how you felt your whole life.
Yeah, definitely. When I told my former boss at work, hey, like, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I'm going through, his immediate reaction was like, why haven't you told me about this before? Like, for him, he was thinking of it being, quite normalized and thinking, man, like, how could I have supported you, with this previously? And I was just there like, because I've never talked about it before, I'm not personally in denial, but that fear of how other people would judge and perceive me because of past experience.
And given that you've been so worried about that for so long, and on the other side of that is you thinking there's something wrong with me, basically, like, it would be better if I wasn't this way, and other people would think that as well. How's that impacted your relationship with yourself over the years? Has there been self-loathing there as a result of that?
Yeah, I pretty much went through a period where I just hated myself. I probably a lot through those like late primary to middle high school sort of years, I just didn't like myself basically. And it got to a point by the time I was in year 10, I was so just depressed and suicidal, all that kind of stuff, but was still in that state, like a lot of blokes are, where it's like, I've got to just deal with this. So
what was at the core of those really strong feelings about yourself now that you reflect on it? What was it that you hated?
I think just the way that I thought, the way that my brain works, the way that I communicate, the way that I relate to other people. It was very, very holistic self-loathing in the sense that there wasn't one specific thing that I could latch onto. It was everything.
You just wished you were different. You wish you were like other people, and you felt like there was no way you could be.
Yeah, it was a lot of, I guess, envy of others. You know, I'm not a jealous person by any stretch, but a lot of that, man, I wish I wasn't like this. I wish I was somebody else. And when you conflate that with all the other emotions you're going through as a teenager in particular, that then leads to, what if I wasn't here anymore, basically.
And it's exhausting trying to be someone else too, trying to approach a situation and present whatever you think people want to see. And often it doesn't work very well either. How did it go for you putting that mask on and trying to show people whatever you thought they wanted to see? What was the result from that?
I have a lot of people who kind of comment on how I was when I was like late teen and how kind of out there and outlandish and hyper energetic and everything I was. Whereas now I'm like real easygoing, pretty chilled. And I think the biggest part of that was like, I was so heavily masking back then and putting on this persona of how I thought I would be accepted by others. Almost kind of like clutching at straws, being like, please love me.
But what about through your 20s?
It led to, look, I'd probably say like about 2 or 3 years of real deep soul searching to kind of be like, actually, who am I? Actually, who do I want to be? And stepping away from that feeling of, I need to be XYZ to be loved and accepted. Once I stepped away from that into this space of, I'm going to do me. I'm going to be the best me that I can possibly be. And everything else kind of fell into place around that. It led me to meeting my amazing girlfriend, who I've been with now for almost 5 years. It's led me to work that I've found to be really fulfilling. It's led me to meaningful relationships with, you know, that handful of people that are lifelong friends rather than 20 million, you know, surface level connections. And it's led me to a much more fulfilling life overall.
But you're only now talking about this and talking about the last year of saying that you're on the autism spectrum. But you're talking about sort of 5 years of things getting better. So what's different now compared to 5 years ago, compared to 10 years ago, in terms of what you've gone through and your change in perspective?
A big part of it has just been the discourse around mental health, around disability, around being on the spectrum. Now, even like the definitions of what all that stuff really means 10, 20 years ago when I was first diagnosed, they're all completely different. You know, so like I was diagnosed with auditory processing disorder and sensory integration disorder, which are like two portions of this big color wheel that is the autism spectrum, right? But back then it was like, you're autistic or you're not. You have ADD or you don't. You have ADHD or you don't. So like it was just black and white and the definitions were just finite. Whereas now the way that we perceive it is so vastly different. The support that's available for people who are diagnosed now is so completely different. So I've had to kind of switch out of this mindset from you are this, you will only ever be this, and if you tell people you are this, then you will not be loved or accepted, into a space of, wow, there's actually a lot of people who are, A, B, C, D, the whole color wheel, and they seem to be loved, they seem to be accepted for being, vocal about who they are.
So seeing all those examples, that really has a big impact compared to in the past where you thought you were the only person like this, or you saw some other kids like that, but they weren't really being accepted either, so you didn't want that result.
Yeah, and especially my experience with occupational therapy when I was a kid, it was so expensive doing one-on-one consult kind of stuff, so that led to me doing stuff in a group setting at hospitals and stuff. And yeah, like I said, there were kids who had, much more severe needs than myself. So then I wasn't getting the support that I needed. And even now, man, I'll watch shows about, people who are on the spectrum, Love on the Spectrum. I'll watch The Assembly that's just been on the ABC.
I've been watching that too.
Yeah, and I watch that and I think to myself, I'm not like that. There's this disconnect almost of what is kind of portrayed as being on the spectrum versus what my reality has kind of felt like.
But there's levels.
There is.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I look at it and go, representation is still that. It's still important. It's still valuable. And it still allows people to feel like what they're going through is normal, is normalized, is accepted. And yeah, I can look at, for me personally, and think, I might only have a little bit of that kind of stuff going on or that experience compared to other people's needs. But heck, if they can, appreciate and understand those severe needs, surely they can understand my, surely smaller needs, I guess, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's a spectrum.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
But your own experience, it's all relative. It's still something that's had a massive impact on your life. It's still something that you felt like you've had to hide for your whole life. And I think partly the fact that it has been lower level and less obvious has given you at least a chance of being able to conceal it, and therefore feeling like you needed to, and having this tug of war with yourself of feeling like you should be another way, but knowing the way that you are, and you've carried that your whole life. And as happens so often on this show, speaking to people about their anxiety and their fear around coming out in whatever way it may be, and speaking to people about who they actually are, the fear of that's way worse than the reality is. But I think it is significant because it's still something that you've lived with for all this time that's coloured your life, and more so probably because it isn't as obvious as some other cases where it would be different.
Yeah. And it's something that I relate to quite a lot with people who, let's take for example with The Assembly, right? So I was watching the Amanda Keller episode, and she was talking about her experience with her husband being diagnosed with Parkinson's 6 years ago, and the weight that she felt when she could finally feel like she talked about it. And there's a lot to be said for that, when people feel this sense of shame about what's happening in their world. It doesn't matter what it's about, but when people feel that sense of shame and the weight that brings upon you, when you finally relinquish that and you start talking about what's going on in your head, what's happening in your world, the just weightlessness that you feel afterwards, and how much better it is just having that conversation, it's incredible. So a big part of it for me has been looking at, I guess, ultimately my experience with my mental health and how much better things got when I started talking about my issues, and then translating that into, okay, well, what's underlying all of that? Well, it's the fact that I'm on the spectrum. So I guess if I'm more vocal and open about that, then maybe I'll feel that weightlessness and, shaking off the blanket, so to speak.
And finding a therapist who understands the neurodivergent piece is really important, because it changes the whole approach.
Absolutely.
So that's been significant for you too.
Yeah, because I first saw a psychologist when I was in year 12, and the approach that was taken, that they were more centered towards kids and young people, but their approach to me felt like it was like psychology for dummies kind of thing. It's like, if you have a bad thought, think to yourself, is this rational? I'm like, I know it's not rational. That's why I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
I want to shut out the voices. I want to, I want to fix, basically, is what I was looking for. And it's not as simple as that. But yeah, I kind of internalized the way that their approach was kind of given to me of like, I'm not stupid. I know what's going on in my head. I need strategies on how to deal with it. So it's taken me till now where, my girlfriend encouraged me to go back, try again, seek help, talk to a therapist. And the one that I'm seeing currently also deals predominantly with younger people, but people on the spectrum. And that was the number one call out that I needed. It was like, I need someone who kind of gets that. And she's been incredible, absolutely fantastic. She'll probably be pretty stoked that I've, come on here and talking about my experience, even because
the communication style is different and it just makes sense versus it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just that sense of understanding. You go to someone who maybe doesn't have as much knowledge in that space, so they're probably still with that old school mindset of, oh, you're just lazy, you're just overreacting, over emotional, whatever, too sensitive, versus, okay, no, this is a real experience for you. Let's unpack that.
And they can tell you why it's happening.
That's it.
What does making music do for you?
Music's always been such a huge relief for me. It's therapy, ultimately. It always has been since I was a little kid. Like, I started listening to electronic music in particular about like 7 or 8, and that was my thing. That was my special interest, my thing.
That's young to get on the bangers.
Yeah. I've always had that, special interest. Like, when you're a really little kid, it was like Thomas the Tank Engine and Yu-Gi-Oh and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, from 7 or 8, it was music and video games. Put the two together, I was in my element.
What was that, like Daft Punk back then?
Yeah, the first video clip that got me into that music was Daft Punk Around the World. And also, I used to go to like a lot of those bowling birthday parties and stuff, and they would have the video clips up on the TV screens. Yeah. So
Blue Dabba Dee.
Yeah. But the one that really hooked me instantly was a track called Fall to the Floor, Thin White Duke remix. Yeah. When I saw the video for that and I heard that track, it like something changed in me, man. Like, that was such a pivotal moment for me. I can still so vividly see it, which again is a bit of a, autism superpower, is like just this snapshot in my mind of that exact moment. I can still picture the exact, bowling alley, where I was standing when I was watching it, everything. But that moment's just stuck with me for so long. From that point through to now, like primary school, I used to burn CDs and hand them out to my friends so they could listen to music that I liked. And I started getting into DJing when I was about 14, 15. I've been a DJ ever since. So we're talking like 12, 13 years now.
So for someone who's got a history of being overwhelmed by sound, make that make sense. Like, what happens in your brain when you're making electronic music or you're playing very loud music?
It's something my mum jokes about a lot. She's like, man, you picked the shittest job for you to be involved in, like DJing, loud music, loud, bright lights.
Being overwhelmed by sensations and going into nightclubs, right?
Yeah.
So
it's the recovery's hard, but in the moment you don't feel that. You don't feel like a lot of people that I talk to who, say for example, have like ADHD, love really intense, heavy dance music, like drum and bass, hard techno kind of stuff. And I think what I feel anyways, it's so overpowering for the senses. It just shuts everything else out. It's almost like sensory deprivation for all your other senses because it's so overwhelming for your sense of hearing and sight.
So you can focus on it. So have you felt that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'll sort of go straight into like hyperfixation and what people kind of define as like flow state.
Yeah.
I can just switch into flow state for music instantly. And like I'm there, I'm rolling with it for hours. I'll shut out all other senses to the point where like, yeah, I won't eat, won't drink, won't nothing. I'm locked in on music.
What about the
basically.
creative process with how your brain works? How is that a positive thing or a negative thing?
Yeah, both sides of the coin. Because on one side, I need constant sort of stimulation. So if something's taking a while for me to work out, or struggling with a particular sound, I can get really bogged down and lose that momentum really quickly. But by the same token, when I'm switched in, like I'm on. I can power through a whole song in a day, if not a couple of hours, kind of thing. So it's quite volatile in that sense, whether I'm locked in or not. But when it works like a superpower, basically.
How far have you gotten in the music industry?
Not as far as I'd like to, is the short answer, because the downside of what I was just mentioning before, I think that's taken over a lot of that creative process, caring a lot about what other people think about my work, the music I make, the gigs that I do, whatever. All of that kind of stuff I felt like has kind of held me back a bit. And that idea of perception, how other people see you, that's a huge thing for me, at least on the
Takes
spectrum.
a lot to put your art out there for people to judge or ignore.
Yeah.
Just dig into the vulnerability side of that and how much that affects you.
Yeah, because it's the negative self-talk piece then as well, of like you put something out, no one listens to it, and then you're like telling yourself, yeah, of course no one's listening to it because you suck.
Yeah.
And you just send yourself down this rabbit hole that, as I've alluded to earlier, I've been in my whole life, this rabbit hole of you'll amount to nothing, no one will love you, so on and so forth. Whereas when things go well, there's almost a sense of imposter syndrome to it too, where you're like, oh yeah, things are going well, but someone else has it better, and maybe I'm not deserving of this opportunity. So it can really play against you. And I've felt, particularly over the last couple of years, that I've strayed away from being true to myself in that sense. Whether it be following a trend or trying to fit a particular mold, whatever it might be. But in reality, if you're actually true to yourself, what you love, you'll actually see a lot more success, I think.
So has that brought that self-loathing back or made you drop out of music? How has that impacted your relationship with yourself as an artist and adult man?
Yeah, I went through a pretty rough period about like 2016. And that was right when I was in the thick of things. So I would have a gig Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night till, 5 a.m. type of thing, right? So that was my lifestyle at that point. I was studying music production, and I went through like a pretty messy breakup and lost a lot of friends during that period. But I had to take a step back completely, just cut the ties with the music industry as a whole to focus on my mental health. I've felt on the out, so to speak, since, trying to get back into it now. But the game's completely changed, man. Like since 2016, the presence of things like TikTok's become a thing. The way you promote yourself, the way that you share your work with the world and your art with the world, all of those things are completely different. So I'm almost having to learn a new set of skills just to get my foot back in the door again. And again comes that imposter syndrome and that thing of perception. Like, man, I don't want to post this TikTok where I'm making a fool of myself because people will watch it and think I'm an idiot. And like the music industry and the way that you quote unquote succeed as an artist, it's not made for people on the spectrum. It's not designed to allow people on the spectrum to find success.
So how are you more prepared for the criticism or the lack of attention with that now?
a combination of a lot more self-belief and self-confidence. Because when I first started, the work that I was doing, I was happy with to a point, but it wasn't truly representative of what I loved. It wasn't truly true to myself. The last few years of writing an album, in my case, and really getting sort of close to and honing in on what I love, what I'm passionate about with music, that in itself has been really cathartic. And, you know, when this album comes out, it's like, this is me. This is all of me. Take it or leave it. And that's a huge risk.
Well, that's kind of the point, it seems, of your whole story now, where you've arrived at that point.
Yeah. And I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that in years past, you know.
What's worked for you in building up that confidence? Like, you've gone from someone who hated themselves to someone who accepts and loves themselves and is okay with showing that to the world now. So that's no small feat. That's a pretty big jump. What are actionable things that you've done that's actually changed that relationship with yourself?
I got a lot of value from stepping away from the music industry, which is very fast paced, is very volatile, and is very ego driven. A lot of people place their self-worth on the work. So, like I said before, if someone doesn't like your song, you'll hate yourself. If someone misses out on a gig, you hate yourself. Like, there's all of that kind of ego stuff tied in. Stepping away from that and into like a corporate world where I guess you're seeking the validity from the work itself and the process. You know, I was able to demonstrate competencies and skills in other areas and really back myself to be like, yeah, I'm good at what I do. It's not reliant on other people's opinions. It's reliant on hard facts. It's reliant on, here's the evidence of my work kind of thing. And that's a lot harder to do in the music industry because it's so competitive. If you're in a 9-to-5 corporate job, I mean, you're competing with yourself ultimately. Like, you either did the work or you didn't do the work, right? So I got a lot of value out of that. And
so finding more and more proof that you are capable in whatever form that came in, that you are capable of doing whatever job it is to a good enough standard, and therefore you're worthy of your own respect and therefore other people's as well.
Yeah, especially when, like I said before, in 2016, where my confidence had eroded so much to the point where I didn't feel like I was capable of any success in my life, to then get to a point where, you know, you're starting to be recognized a bit more for your work. And I feel a lot more like I'm sitting on solid foundations now. Whereas if I tried to do this process of an album and everything back then, everything would have crumbled if the album didn't do well.
So from that point in 2016, was it small steps? Were you conscious of, I just need to put one foot in front of the other and slowly build up evidence that I can do stuff? Or did that just happen?
I think, yeah, it's been a byproduct of just trying to get by because I wasn't in the music industry anymore. So instead I had to do something to pay the bills, to, you know, have a job, to live. And it was a byproduct really of stepping away from something that clearly wasn't working for me mentally, for my own mental health and mental safety. Wasn't working for me. So I had to step away. And in hindsight, that was the best decision. Whereas now I feel like I'm more prepared than ever to tackle this giant that is the music industry and the ambitions I've set for myself without that fear of how are other people going to perceive me. It's
because you've built that self-esteem now, so it's not like you're totally reliant on that external feedback, because you've built up that evidence from what you've achieved in various areas, that you know more about who you are and what you're capable of. So you're not at the whim of whatever this person says or that that person says.
Absolutely.
And I suppose being loved by someone partner that you've been with for a long time, that's an important part of that as well.
Yeah, the fact that my girlfriend accepts me exactly as I am. You know, she even said after we were watching telly the other night, she's like, you know, I love you because of your quirks and because of all these idiosyncrasies, not in spite of them. And little things like that, you know, outside of that safe zone I talked about at the start, and my family, having never really experienced anyone outwardly say that to me, it's a game changer. You know, so having those support networks around me, being vulnerable with that inner circle, you know, there's a lot of those struggles I talked about earlier that I never spoke to my parents about. I never spoke to my family about. And now that I am talking about those struggles and the difficulties I've faced, they're a bit more clued in as to what's happening in my head, and they can support me appropriately, as opposed to just kind of guessing that everything's okay because I'm not saying anything.
Why is it important to you to share your story now?
The two big things, really, that sense of freeing oneself, I kind of talked to before. Like, I was thinking about like how sometimes people can kind of make these sorts of moments like a real big deal. Like, you know, almost like you are doing like one of those, you know, apology videos or something where it's like, I'd like to address the nation. Yes, I'm autistic. Like, you know, I'm not going to go out there and do something like that, but I still want to have some sort of line in the sand where I'm like, okay, I'm going to talk about this kind of stuff now. And my album is so centered around my struggles with my mental health and everything. So, you know, I don't want that to be a mic drop kind of moment. But then the other side as well is seeing my girlfriend's little brother and seeing so many of the similarities that he shares with me when I was a little kid. But like, he is so loved and accepted for exactly as he is. He has so much support through all sorts of different, you know, government schemes, all that kind of stuff. So much love around him. And I don't want him to ever feel like he should be ashamed for who he is. I don't want anyone who's listening, who's out there, who might have similar experiences, to have that shame to put upon them, whether by themselves or by others. And there's part of me that kind of wants to, I guess, almost prove a point where it's like, you can do this despite the struggles, despite the difficulties, despite how being on the spectrum impacts you negatively. And it might take longer for you to get to where you're trying to be. In my case, it's more than 10 years, but you will get there. And you do just have to, as you said before, take one step in front of the other. It'll be a slower grind, but you can chase that dream still and find ways to live that fulfilling life that you want.
Well said, man. You're on the right track.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Cal. That's it for this episode. If you like what we're all about, support us by following Young Blood Men's Mental Health on Instagram and Young Blood Mental Health on TikTok. Every podcast episode is recorded in professional quality video, and they're all up on our Young Blood Men's Mental Health YouTube channel. So please show some love and subscribe. You can find everything there is to know about the podcast at youngbloodmensmentalhealth.com. And most importantly, please share these stories with anyone in your life who needs to know they're not alone. We're all in this together. Catch you next time.